concept of having a style, particularly a natural style, is something which applies throughout many different areas of life as well as competitive disciplines. But particularly we see in esports games, in competitive games, across all the different types, different styles of play, different ways that someone's mentality informs the way they then choose to play the game, the different people's skill sets, what tools they have at their disposal, what they're good at, what they're bad at, then play into how they play the game and how effectively they can figure out how to tie their mentality to their toolkit, their skill set, tends to define how good their style is, how effective their style is, and what kind of styles make up the top players. And so I think this is something which actually applies to all levels of players, because basically it applies to everyone in most areas of life, actually. So I think it's something where you even have very good, very skilled pro players who don't necessarily have the right style for either their mentality or the right style in terms of, do they have the skill set to do what they want to do? Is the way they're playing something that can work with their skill set? And so you see some players who perhaps aren't intelligent enough to play a very conservative, passive style where they have to make a lot of decisions and a lot of nuanced questions come to them through the game as to what they're going to do at this point, and then basically sometimes aggression can limit your options and make it so you only have to do one of these three things, and then you can find your success sometimes by luck, sometimes just pushing the matter, making something happening, narrowing the decisions, and making something a very simple battle. And if you had great mechanics in this scenario, maybe you'll win out in that situation, where sometimes you play a more passive game, you have more decisions to make, smaller ones perhaps, over the course of a game, and if you don't make some of them, if you're not that good at that aspect, maybe you won't succeed. Vice versa, there are some players who play aggressively because they have a great skill set, a great toolkit of like great aim, great mechanics. They're very good intuitively in battles, whereas there may be so intelligent, there may be people whose skill set with their intelligence would better applied to playing a very passive style, playing a reactive style, making other people make decisions, and then they punish those mistakes. And you see, there's the different ends of the spectrum as to how you can play, and all the different points along it have to correspond to the different aspects of who is playing the game and what makes them up. So something I think that players, people who are watching this video and are just casual players or at a lower level of competitive play, can certainly think about this, because it's quite vital, and it's something that if you nail and you really put a lot of thought into, can really maximize, basically take your potential of how good you can be and maximize how much of that you can actually manifest tangibly into the world, as opposed to it just being some abstract potential one day. But there's also many pro players who haven't quite nailed this yet. But I think you look at the best players of all time, and that's one of the key things about them, is they are guys who've nailed their overall style. They understand how they're going to play the game. They understand what they're good at. They understand what they're bad at. They make it look as though they're not bad at anything because they minimize what they're bad at. They don't take fights at certain points of the game. They don't take aim battles at certain points of the game. They don't take on certain scenarios which they'd be worse at. They put their game right where their office is, right where they're really good, where they want to be, where the situations they understand come up. And then because they're playing in this area all the time, it just looks like they have total control of the game. It looks like they have mastery. It looks easy. And that's part of the reason why, is because whether they've actually done it on a conscious level, there's been some level of intuitive or self-reflective understanding of who they are, what they can do, and then how to harness the gap between those two and get a style that works for them. So first and foremost, as I referenced there, the style must fit the strengths of the player. And that means first and foremost that you have to look at what your strengths are, and you have to reasonably assess what those strengths are, which also means you're going to have to address your weaknesses, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So addressing the strengths, first and foremost, this actually really means having a mentality that also fits what your strengths are. Once you've figured out your strengths, you're going to have the basics of what your style is going to be, because you're going to know the bread and butter of what you're going to do on a regular basis, how you're going to play generally, that you're going to then practice and that you're going to get your success from. But when you're doing this, your mentality also has to fit this strength and then the style that you're picking. And the reason why I say that is you have a lot of players I've seen throughout the history of many different games who come across as quite delusional, or simply just envy the strengths of someone else and wish they could play that style, and so they then try to enforce that on themselves, and it often has poor results. So I'll give you a CSGO example, I'll give you a League of Legends examples, as I will throughout this video. So in CS 1.6 and CSGO, the player Nothing, the North American player who played for Evil Geniuses in 1.6, and he played for Complexity and Cloud9 in CSGO, famously is probably suited in terms of natural style, skill set and mentality to be a player who's on the front end of the game. He's like an aggressive entry style player, either the first man in, a follow-up guy. He was the original Stewie. He's the guy where if he runs in through a smoke, if you flash for him and he goes around the corner, he's got that like nice mid-range burst aim where he can get the first couple of kills, he can get a couple of crazy headshots, and then he's going to be really effective in that scenario. Unfortunately, his mentality over 1.6 changed so that by the latter years of 1.6, he didn't want to play an aggressive style. He constantly showed a tendency, a predilection to wanting to play a passive style, to wanting to be the clutch player who closes the game out, who's the closer for you in the round, and wanting to be the really intelligent player. And I've even talked to him, and he used to say to me, no, I want to be like a really complete player, I want to have the complete all-round package. Now that's all well and good, but the problem is he hadn't figured out how to master those other elements. He was decent in some areas of that, but he wasn't fitting his best strengths. So an Evil Geniuses used to drive Lurpers crazy. He didn't have this guy's full skills accessed where he wanted them because he was trying to play a different style. We've seen it in CSGO. It's been one of the problems Sean Gers has had, Semphis has had with nothing over the years. Would he play the particular style he wanted to, or would he change his mind and want to play a different role? And so they haven't always been able to get the role balance in their teams. The same thing happened actually in the same sense to Nitro, the player who plays for Team Liquid, where before Hiko joined the team, he often looked like a beta. He tried to play like a semi-lurk style. He used to just never go in first. It looked like he baited his teammates. If he's losing a round, he wouldn't play in any way aggressively and try to make plays. He wouldn't be a playmaker. If you think of him now, this guy is naturally one of the best North American playmakers in CSGO. When you had him unlocked by Elige, who started this entry duo with him, where they worked together on different sides of the map, and one goes first or the other goes first, depending on which side of the map they're on, as in which part of the map, not which side, CTLT. When this happened, we saw suddenly he became the best NA player. He absolutely is a great playmaker. He can open rounds up for you, can create great situations for you, and as a result, Team Liquid was always more successful when he played this style, but he previously wanted to play that lurking style. Even after Simple came, he tried to go back to that lurking style, and it's never been as good for them. In League of Legends, I think an obvious example would be the player Rush, the Korean jungler who played for Team Impulse. And, well, I mean, in theory, he was playing with, he played with Cloud9, but that had its ups and downs, obviously, and he is not really around anymore. He's streaming at the moment. This is a player where you put him on carry champions, you put him on playmaking junglers, and he absolutely can take over the whole game. He can be the best player on your team. He can get lanes which aren't even that good, like Tip. He can get them ahead, or he can give them chances to win, and he can just individually snowball the game so much as a jungler in how incredible he was at 1v1ing and ganking, that he can just literally be one of the biggest impact players in the whole game. But then you saw times, for example, when the meta switched a little bit. I think it was spring 2015 when they went against TSM and he tried to just play Nunu all the time. When you put him on those tank junglers, in general, it's not going to be as good. It doesn't fit his style, doesn't fit his mentality, and his skill set's kind of wasted there. Put him on a Nunu or a Sejuani or something, what's the point? You're not making use of his skill set, and because of his mentality and how he thinks of how the game is modelled, which then feeds into his style, even his style was wrong for that Nunu. That's why it also didn't work. He was trying to flash snowball people, as opposed to playing the natural way that you do with Nunu, like counter-ganking people, just making life hell for the other jungler and negating him to some degree, like a classic Bengi style. He wasn't fit for this whatsoever, and as a result, he wasn't maximizing his efficiency and his effective nature for his team, actually. Now, as well as knowing your strengths and fitting your style around that, you also need your style, once you've got your strength set, to minimize your weaknesses, but without compromising your strengths. So you can't just look at a weakness and go, that's a weakness of mine, so I'm never going to go anywhere near that. I'm never going to allow that ever to come into my game, but then as a result, compromise your strength. Because if you do that, then you're going to be a weaker player overall. So even though you'll shore up some of your weaknesses, because you'll reduce some of your strengths, it's like to take from one, you take from the other. To give to one, you take from the other, essentially. What you have to find a way to do is think about how your weaknesses at the moment manifest into things that are unnecessary. So if you have your strength nailed, and you're very good at this particular area, over in this other area, if you have a weakness, perhaps sometimes, for example, let's say your strength is you're a very aggressive player who makes plays, who creates something out of nothing, and then from that, you can get huge advantages, your team can win out, right? An obvious way to shore up a weakness there is those sorts of players, until they've really put in a lot of work developing their style and their skill set, often have a mentality where they think they have to create the play like that. They think that when nothing's happening in the game, they must make a play. They have to go for every little opportunity because they're so good at making a lot out of nothing that they think they have to go for all of it. So what happens generally is you can define their weaknesses over aggression or pushing the matter too much, being too greedy, and also usually as a result dying too much and giving away scenarios, like reverse snowballing game or snowballing the game for your opponent. So in this scenario, all this player has to do is not be less aggressive, not gank less, not do what TSM tried to tell Wild Turtle in summer of 2015, oh, just don't ever flash in, don't go aggressive like that. No. What they need to do is figure out his strength is being aggressive, is playing right up in people's faces, trying to do lots of damage. His problem in that scenario in League of Legends was, if you caught him early, like the classic double scenario, in CLG, if you caught him early because he was over-aggressive at that, and you killed him, then that's it. The fight's over. He's lost all that gold that he's holding in his champion there, and all the items that it represent, etc., is gone from the fight. He can't do anything. He has to be more selective with when he does that, and as a result, has to work a lot to learn when to do that. And then once he knows the right time, then he can just let go. He can just go the fifth gear. He's unchained, and he can make those plays that you know he can make. So that's a key difference. And he can go the other way as well. Now, a point to make is, it is true that the all-time great players in sports or games do tend to be people who found a way to minimize their weakness, but actually, because their weakness is usually a function of their strength, which I'll talk about in a minute, they actually worked on their weakness so much that it actually became a strength of theirs, and sometimes a primary strength. So I've got a couple of sports examples here that I think are particularly notable, because the key point is, oftentimes the reason why they worked on their weakness so much is that since they were so great as players, that's what people would attack often, and therefore they worked on their weakness so that their weakness became effectively a counter. Because in the game, you have the thing you want to do, your natural strength, what you're the best at, and so when you do that, most people are going to have some sort of defensive or reactive approach to that they're going to try and shut it down, minimize it, make it not as good. So if your counter is then essentially something that defeats what they try to do as their own counter to your main strength, so what they're trying to do to you've worked on so much that you then have a counter to that. That's how you become like the guy who dominates the whole game, how no one can really stop you. You can be minimized, you can sometimes lose, but in general, you're going to remain one of the absolute best of all time. So two great examples would be the two greatest players of their game, Michael Jordan and Roger Federer. So in basketball, Michael Jordan, early on in his career, let's say the first 4 or 5 seasons, and overall, sort of like the first 6 or 7 seasons, early on, he really was a slasher. What he was all about was his athleticism, speed, jumping, was so good that you couldn't defend him one-on-one. The rules at the time, isolation rules, you weren't allowed to use zone defense, meant that in general, you could cheat over a little bit with the help defense, but you had to, in general, play him 1v1. And so it was incredibly hard to find anyone who was athletic enough, especially because in basketball, the defender's going backwards to some degree, you're going forwards, so you'll always have a speed advantage if you're faster than him anyway. It was very hard to get someone who could stop Michael Jordan from going to the basket. And so Michael Jordan's very much obsessed, the first few years, that was his strength and his style, of slashing through the lane, going to the basket, making it, like LeBron did early on in his career, all about like a foot race, strength, speed, athleticism. Because if you go into that area, they're going to win out. Michael Jordan's going to win the majority of those scenarios, and he's going to be incredible in that particular area. But as a result, people started figuring out styles that you could play against that to be effective. So two of the great teams that used to stop Michael Jordan in the playoffs early on was the Boston Celtics of Larry Bird and McHale, and obviously the Detroit Pistons, who invented the Jordan rules. And what both these teams did, because they were both incredible defensive teams, is figure out, right, well, since that's his strength, we're going to play lots of people defensively in the lane. We're essentially going to block off his ability to go to the basket. We're going to make it very hard. We're going to put our most defensive player on him, but then lead him into traps of other players who are going to be there once he goes for the shot. And as a result, we're going to beat him up a bit inside, but also just not going to let him get inside and get these shots. And now, Michael Jordan still had good games against those teams. The difference is he couldn't just dominate the way he was against everyone else in the regular season when he'd be putting on like 50-point games and just wrecking everyone. In general, these teams could contain him overall, enough for their team to win. Now, what Michael Jordan did as a result is obsessively work, first and foremost, early on stuff like his strength, so that he could go through all this defense, he could take the hits, and he could still make and ones. That was his initial counter to it. His long-term counter was to go from being an average or a slightly above average shooter to working on shooting so much that a 2-point contested fadeaway shot became his signature move in the NBA. By the way, one of the lowest percentage shots you can have in the NBA for most players. Became his bread and butter move in his latter days in that second three-peat, 96 to 98. That was his go-to move, and he became the best in the league at it, one of the best of all time at it, and that became his main move then. Now, obviously, his athleticism dropped off later in his career, so he had to go to that more, but developing this particular weakness into a strength allowed him to be absolutely dominant. You couldn't really play him in that particular sense. You could do your best, but you could never shut him down entirely. You could never make him lose the game for himself to some degree. And that's one of the areas in which he developed that weakness into a primary strength in that particular sense. Then you got to look at Roger Federer. So when Roger Federer came along and was absolutely dominant around like 2004, 2005, no one could stop this guy. The only time he used to lose was on clay and to Nadal. Now, after that, it's true, Nadal then started to get better on the other surfaces. He was the second best player, by the way. He started to get good on grass and be going to the Wimbledon finals. And then in later years, 2009, 2010, now he was getting to the finals of Australian Open, of US Open, etc. So now his main rival had to contend with him on all surfaces. Now the key thing that Rafa Nadal figured out to beat Roger Federer was not just Nadal's natural strength, which is being able to run down every ball, to fight non-stop, to kind of like be better on the latter end of the game because of stamina than other people are, to draw games out and to come from behind. Sure, those are all his natural strengths, but the key thing he did against Roger Federer was he would learn how to play every shot he could into Federer's backhand. Because even though Federer had every shot in the game, it's one thing he's very famous at, his backhand was good, but it wasn't the best. It wasn't the sick backhand. It wasn't like what Wawrinka has right now as an insane backhand. It wasn't like that. He didn't have that sort of strength on the backhand. And so as a result, that's one of the shots where, first of all, he wouldn't be as accurate doing game-winning shots, which is Federer's whole style, being able to hit a game winner from everywhere. And also, Federer's best shot was the forehand. So by going to Federer's backhand all the time, which, by the way, it also helped that Nadal bizarrely was like a two-handed, left-handed player, so he was hitting his shots anyway in that direction, in his natural strength. By doing this over and over again, you could see the stats from some of these classic games from like 2007 to 2010. It allowed Nadal to win an insane amount of games against Federer. But one of the things Federer did improve a lot on, and why at least in the latter days, I mean, first of all, on other surfaces anyway, he could beat Nadal, but in the latter days, he became very good in this area, is now, in the modern day, Federer has a much better backhand. In fact, now his backhand's got pretty good. It's still not at that insane Wawrinka, Murray, Djokovic type level, but it got very, very good. And it certainly got a lot better than it was before. And it became a strength so that even if he still couldn't beat Nadal very often, he would now beat a bunch of other players more with that style than he would before. So as soon as you thought you had a blueprint to beat him, he worked on that. And now you couldn't just beat him on that area alone either. Now, one of the aspects that's interesting about this is, like I said, it's also about the mentality of how you model the game, how you think about the game. And so as a result, on a basic level, it's going to be about your personality as well, who you think of as yourself as a person, who you are as a person, and then how that informs the way you act in the world. And so you can look at it on a personality level because it's about the choices that you're going to make based on who you think you are and who you want to be. So on a professional level, for example, one thing I did a few years ago, it was around late sort of 2012 going into 2013, was I decided I'd put a lot of work into all my strengths in terms of work, like research, trying to write historical stuff, trying to get every detail and remember stuff to be able to interview players and to do with these articles in ways that other people wouldn't have access to that information because they wouldn't know where to look for it. I'd put in so much work there, but I realized another aspect of becoming better is I wanted to be able to get my opinion out there. I wanted to be able to be the person where I don't see this opinion represent right now. I don't see someone addressing this topic in the way that I would, so I'm going to do that. Now, doing that meant that I had to accept, just as there are weaknesses and there's going to be aspects of the style that you don't like, I had to accept you're going to be hated. Some people aren't going to like that opinion. Some people are going to be put off your work entirely. So I had to accept that overall because a key function of this, a key aspect of this style, the natural style or the developed style, is going to be the notion that you can't have your strength without some component of a weakness being tied to that. Because in general, the weakness will tend to be an actual function. It will be the dark side compared to the light side. The light side is the strength, the dark side is the weakness. The weakness will in some way be a function of whatever gave you the strength in the first place, or a smaller component of it directly. And so to make a stylistic point on this, I'll give you some examples. I mean, an obvious one from sports would be if you have a team like the Golden State Warriors, or in the past, like the 7 seconds or less Phoenix Suns of 2005 to 2007, if you have these sorts of teams that are jump shooting teams and they're all about taking a shot reasonably quick and about being 3-point shots, you are going to be incredible in that area of the game. You're going to be able to always come back in the games. You're going to be able to blow teams out. And when it's all working, you're going to have a pace that no team can match. But when your jump shot isn't falling, when teams play good defense, when they lock you off from the inside, now you're going to be in some troubles and you're going to have your difficulties there. And what's your counter to that be? Those two teams still haven't fully come up with counters. They've been very good teams over the history of the NBA, but they never necessarily found the counters to be the dominant teams that some of the other teams were in history. Now, in terms of some esports teams, I'll give you two League of Legends examples first. Whenever people talk about Samsung White, the team that was Imp, Mata, Pawn, Dandy, and Looper, the team that won the World Championship in Season 4, what's great about this particular lineup is, over the first 15 or so minutes of the game, they were unreal. Maybe the best team ever in the early game. They were so unbelievable, and then obviously the Danda and Mata synergy to get vision control and then be able to exploit that early meant that they could just dominate that first 15 minutes against pretty much every team, it felt like, especially when they were on form. But they had this famous thing where from like 25 minutes on in the game, if the opponent was in the game in any way, they would go so ham trying to close it and utterly dominate them. Sometimes they would give the whole game away. Famously, they did it against Blue a bunch of times, who were obviously gods at that particular sense of coming back from 25 minutes onwards in the game and being incredible late-game team-fighting team. So that's obviously the worst example to be going against, and that's why that was the team that used to beat Samsung White. But in general, they would give teams chances. Now, what's funny is people used to look at that and go, oh, see, they should just play more passive at that point in the game, and didn't understand that the whole point is the weakness is tied to the strength there. And like I said, you can't just minimize the weakness and then think, oh, that's it, I've just minimized the weakness, no problem. Did you compromise your strength? Now, the key point is, I always used to say this, I don't think it ever was that they just got too cocky and all the rest of it. Now, they might have been thinking that in their mind, but I actually think this was their style. That when they were ahead like that, they tried to just kill you dead immediately, because that's incredibly intimidating, and they could do it a lot of the time. Also, they tried to kill you in that particular manner because they were so aggressive. If they saw an opportunity, they would dive on it, try and make the most of it, and that's what made them so dominating over the first 15 minutes of a game. So I don't think it was just that simple scenario of don't be as aggressive late, oh, don't go as ham and all the rest of it. That, unfortunately, was an aspect where only a few teams could ever exploit that, and that was in general their overall style. And when it worked, as we saw at Season 4 Worlds, that's why they looked like the most dominant team of all time at that one tournament. Like, that looked like the top peak of what a team could do to you, because by winning every game in the first 20 minutes, basically. Then let's think of Moscow 5, Gambit. Now, when Moscow 5 was at their best, and when Gambit was very good but not as good the next year, you look at the team, what changed that much? Now, it wasn't necessarily that they all dropped off individually and all this. No, what really happened was they were one of the teams which somehow had the miracle lineup. Like, they got these 5 players together, and somehow the strengths of these players covered the weaknesses of other players. Synergies existed within the team. They had unique playing styles, but that somehow fit together. So to me, Moscow 5 and Gambit is the ultimate example of the intuitive style. A style which wasn't developed, which just worked, and then everyone somehow was complementary to everyone else on a playing level, not necessarily personality-wise, because we know some of the clashes went on there. And so when they would play even in the game, there wasn't as much direct shot calling. There wasn't as much stuff planned out on how they'd play the team fight, because famously in the team fights, they even had a great combination of who would tank, and then who would be aggressive, and then when people would wait, and when people would join the fight, and then how they would fight, and the way they would turn back on opponents who'd gone away from them. This was so incredible that when it worked, it was amazing. Their problem was, in the latter days of League of Legends, as teams became more strategic, as teams learned how not to fight them at certain points in times, as teams built new compositions that worked well against them, now they had more difficulty because they couldn't adapt, because it's more difficult when you're playing just that natural style to adapt to a new approach. They would have had to consciously analyze the game and figure out why we're doing this way, and then what can we tweak and what would fit our new style. And so because they were so used to never having to second guess themselves, always being able to go off their intuition, always just playing the way that felt naturally right to them, that eventually became one of their problems later, because they'd never worked on their weaknesses in a purposeful manner to be able to improve in that particular sense. Because that's the point. It is going to be possible to improve those aspects or to change your style. But the reason why you're going to do it in the first place, develop that style, figure out that style, is because it's a lot harder to change it than it is to look at what you're good at now and fit everything to that and move away from some of the weaknesses. Now, 2 CSGO examples I'll give for this is the LDLC/Envious team of late 2014, early 2015, the one that had Smiths and Shocks in it. What was great about this team was they really did break the metagame initially. They had this super loose style with a lot of skill over all the positions roughly, and it meant that they were very hard to deal with, because this loose style meant very little actual strats. They'd have bases which they played off, and people made their own little autonomous mini decisions within that, and then that's where the success would come from. And they had so much skill across the team that they could get things done in different ways every single time. And so you could never really read what they were going to do. There wasn't a lot of flashes and smokes to be able to know what's going to come next or to know what the counter's going to be. So that meant when it worked, they terrorized teams. They brutalized teams. They won. They had their own maps like Cash Dust 2 that they were monsters on, that people just couldn't stop them on. And it didn't matter what you did. When they were in their prime, aside from a team like Fnatic, no one really was beating this team with regularity. But it was so predicated on skill. It was so predicated on those small decision-making, intuitive, autonomous plays by their own players that they didn't have the structure. They didn't have a system in place. So there was no fallback. They didn't have the existence that God B, whoever you want to pick out, style that's more structured, Carrigan, to where when something went wrong in the strat, there's a second option. There's a plan B. They didn't have the option where when someone's having a really off game, we can find a way to shift him over here, make him useful, and still do different strats. They were so based around finding good skill matchups that is what they had to win and lose on, and they didn't develop the other aspect. Now, the last example I'll give is going to be Virtus Pro, because Virtus Pro has had the same 5-man lineup for 3 years in CSGO. It's a record in CSGO. As a result of that insane lineup, first of all, they've had some of the best teamwork of all time. The way they naturally play off each other, because they play for so long, and they know in an in-depth level what every other person on their team likes to do, is going to do, what his reaction would be, it makes some of their team play amazing, to a level that, to some degree, you can't get to. Now, you can in other teams like Fnatic, NiP have had incredible team play of their own, but on a very specific sense of knowing what the other person is going to do on your team, they have an advantage that other people don't have. But as a result, a disadvantage that comes with it, that other people would have had, and other people avoided by changing players, is when a player falls off and he can't fulfill his role anymore, VP has to do this weird switch up where someone else plays his role. Or they have to take that guy with a reduced impact on his role and try and win from that. And as a result, even though they've been very good for a long time, they haven't won as many championships as other teams. Because they can't minimize that weakness, essentially, without drawing away from their strength. So they've been stuck in a no man's land at times. Now, they've also come back to their strengths and been able to use their strengths, and their strengths are what, in general, they fit their style to, if you look at that very defined Virtus Pro style of play. Now, what's interesting about this topic is I once raised a similar kind of question in a more abstract sense to a player called QXC, who was a Terran player from, I think it's from USA, in StarCraft 2. And I did an interview with him in, I think it was 2011. I'll link it in the description box below, on when I used to work for SK. And as part of this long interview, because he's a very intelligent player, a guy who's very reflective and has thought a lot about the game, I asked him if in StarCraft 2, because you have the 3 races, Terran, Protoss, Zerg, if there's something about those races determined what kind of style you could play for them, and therefore some players might be playing a race they weren't suited for, where their skill set would have worked for another race. So, by the way, a lot of people modelled the game that way. Like, for example, famously in StarCraft 2, a lot of people said Bisu probably shouldn't have played Protoss. He should have actually played Terran because of the harassment style. If you think of like the dropship style, etc., that people like MMA used, feels like Bisu would have been better at that with his multitasking and would have just been an incredible player playing that style. Now, with that said, Hero, the Team Liquid hero, also played quite an aggressive harassment style as Protoss himself and made it work. So maybe that's not like a perfect example. But this is just a way of modelling the game. It's not reality. It's a way of modelling reality. So when I asked him that, what's funny is he actually disagreed and countered that he actually thinks that instead people just took what they said were the traits of the races based on reverse engineering the style of play of the best players for those races. So people looked at what the best players did. He gave the example of in 2011, the best foreign Zergs were actually Ret and Idra, and they played a very slow macro style where they didn't do anything aggressive early on. And then people as a result said, right, Zerg can't be aggressive early on. They can't do these things like that. And he made the case that instead, people just took that and then that became their worldview and thought it was that way. Now, what's funny is, obviously, because of the race aspect, which doesn't exist in League of Legends, doesn't exist in CSGO, in theory, that's not necessarily a point that applies to the other games. Although, obviously, in League of Legends, people might say you can only play a champion a certain way. Like, people used to famously say, Lulu's just about playing like a safe style, and then you're just going to make other people on the game more successful, when they were talking about mid-Lulu. And then you see some players like Faker were like solo killing with Lulu, and obviously were like lane bullying, etc., which you can do anyway. But we're actually playing it in an aggressive manner. I mean, a famous example is I remember talking to Prolly once, and he told me that he thought people didn't play aggressive enough as Orianna. They thought the same thing. It's a safe champ, good in every matchup, you play for the team fight. He thought, no, if you play with these skills aggressively, you can create a lot of scenarios, you can be a playmaker, you can get a lot of kills that people wouldn't think you can because of aggressive playing of that champion. So, one of the things is, in this scenario, to give it a CSGO example, people might also say, if you're like an entry player, you have to play a certain way. But as I described in my video, which I'll link up there, the one that was about support players in CSGO, I don't think it works that way. I think it's a spectrum, and all roles can play different ends of the spectrum depending on what their skill set is. So the part of the reason why, to harmonise with his point, I do think to some degree, it's not that you have like a purely natural style. Like, it's not like if you sat a child down who'd never lived a life at all, had him playing a game, he would just naturally do certain things, don't do certain things. I don't necessarily know that works so much. I think probably part of how you play the game is based on some strengths you've had in your life earlier and other aspects of life. And so you've modeled, I think of myself as this sort of a person. I am these things, labels, intelligent or aggressive, or I like to play passively, or I like to make a lot of decisions, or whatever things you already think of as yourself. You then come into games, you probably do impose some of them on the game. Then when you play the game initially, the way that you're initially having success, you probably think, right, well, that's what I'm good at. So you practice that more, and then you're not as good at some things, so it's not as fun to practice that. I think that probably does describe how you naturally develop your style. But the point is about this video, essentially, if you were to boil it down in terms of why you can't just play any style initially, is because of all those factors, whatever they may be, how you get to this position where you have these strengths now. If you right now fit your style to your strengths and avoid the most obvious weaknesses, then you're going to have the most success now. Now, in the future, you might want to change your habits. You might want to change your style, but that's going to mean habit changing. That's going to mean day by day, in practice, not in official games, you're going to change small things. You're going to reflect on how you do something slightly differently. You're going to watch things and think about how they're doing it and change your mentality slightly. And in time, gradually, you can change things, but it's going to be an active habit. It's not going to change overnight. You're not just going to be able to play a different style overnight. And so that's going to be a lot of work. Now, if you do it, if you're incredible, like the Michael Jordan, Federer examples, it'll make you a better player. It'll make you an all-time great player. But for most people, they should work on the basics first. They should get their style down, then they should do this other aspect. And especially when you're changing it, it's only going to be in practice, when you practice with purpose, that you're going to change how you play the game and how you model the game mentally. Because in the game itself, because you're fitting to your natural strengths, that's going to provide comfort. And so you're not going to have to second guess yourself in the normal game if you play your style. You're not going to have to think, oh, but you should do that. No, you're going to fit to your style, and that's going to make you better as a result, because you're going to be playing with the subconscious, with your unconscious aspect of all the things you know and are pre-programmed into the muscle memory and the reactions and the flow charts in your mind as to what you do next. And that's going to give you a great amount of success in the game now, even though, yes, you could play a different style in theory.